My name is Trevor Lang. I'm 34 years old, and for 6 years I taught English at a private academy in Daegu, South Korea, before I met the woman who would become my wife. Her name was Soo Jin. She worked nights in the emergency department at a hospital across the city, and we met through a mutual friend at a barbecue restaurant near my apartment in the spring of my 4th year in Korea. She had this way of laughing that made the whole table lean in, and she asked more questions about my life than anyone I dated in Korea ever had. We were married 18 months later, in a small ceremony her parents barely tolerated because I wasn't Korean, and for 3 years our marriage was, by any reasonable measure, normal. Good stretches, hard stretches, the ordinary friction of two people learning each other across a language and a culture. By our 3rd year together, I was tired of teaching. The hours were brutal, the pay had plateaued, and I missed the version of a career path that existed back home. Soo Jin had been talking for over a year about training to become a registered nurse in the United States, where the credentialing pathway, despite being difficult, paid significantly better than what she was making in Korea. We applied for her immigrant visa together. It got approved faster than either of us expected. We had a target move date, 6 weeks out. That's when things started to shift. Soo Jin enrolled in an English conversation academy that spring, telling me she wanted to sharpen her fluency before we landed in the States. I thought it was practical. I encouraged it. She started staying there late several nights a week, sometimes until 9 or 10, which struck me as a lot of hours for a conversation class, but I didn't push. Around the same time, I noticed our couple photo had disappeared from her Kakao Talk profile. It had been there for 2 years, a picture from our honeymoon in Jeju, both of us squinting into the sun on a black sand beach. I asked her about it casually one evening. She said she was just updating her profile and would put it back eventually. She never did. When I asked again a week later, she got defensive in a way that didn't match the size of the question. That became the pattern over the following weeks. A coldness that hadn't been there before. Short answers. A kind of low-grade hostility that flared up over things that used to be nothing. Whose turn it was to do dishes, what time dinner happened, whether I'd left my shoes by the door again. She started staying out some nights, always with a reasonable-sounding explanation. A co-worker's birthday. A study group for the academy's advanced track. I believed every one of them, because I had no reason not to. Then came a Thursday night in early October, 4 weeks before our flight to the States. Soo Jin told me she was staying at her sister Mi-rae's apartment that night because Mi-rae and her husband had an early flight to Vietnam the next morning and needed help getting to the airport before sunrise. It made sense. Mi-rae lived close to Incheon, and Soo Jin had helped with airport runs before. Around 11 that night, I sent her a message on Kakao Talk, just checking in, asking if everything was set for the morning. The message sat there unread. No double check mark, no read receipt, nothing. I assumed she'd fallen asleep early, given the early flight. I called twice over the next hour. No answer either time. By 1 in the morning, I was sitting up in bed with my phone in my hand, watching the unread message sit there with a kind of stillness that started to feel less like sleep and more like something else. I opened the app and scrolled to Mi-rae's profile. The little green dot next to her name showed she was online. I called her directly. Mi-rae picked up sounding confused, half asleep, but alert enough to understand my question immediately. She said Soo Jin wasn't there. She said she hadn't seen her at all that evening and that she and her husband's flight wasn't until the following week, not tomorrow morning. There was no airport run happening. There never had been one planned. I sat there holding the phone, feeling something drop through my chest. Mi-rae, to her credit, didn't hesitate. She said she'd call Soo Jin herself and find out what was going on and that she'd get back to me. 15 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Soo Jin. Her voice was tight, defensive before I'd even said anything. I told her, as calmly as I could manage at 1:30 in the morning, with my hands shaking, that she needed to come home immediately. I told her that if she didn't, I was done. That whatever was happening, I wasn't going to sit in our apartment waiting for an explanation that kept changing shape. She arrived a little over an hour later. The story she gave me, sitting on the edge of our bed still in her coat, was that she'd gone out to help 2 single friends from the academy who wanted to go clubbing in Seomyeon but didn't want to go alone. She said she'd gone along as moral support, that she had zero interest in anyone there, that it had just run later than planned and she'd lost track of time and panicked about how to explain it, so she'd made up the airport story without thinking it through. It was a strange enough explanation that some part of me wanted to believe it, because the alternative was too large to hold standing up. But something about the way she avoided my eyes while she said it didn't sit right. I asked for her phone. She hesitated, just half a second, but I caught it, before handing it over. I opened Kakao Talk and scrolled to the top of her conversation list. The first chat wasn't with either of the friends she'd named. It was with a name I didn't recognize, a man listed under what was clearly a saved contact from the English Academy. I started screenshotting. My hands were steady in a way that surprised me, the way you get steady when your body understands something your mind hasn't fully caught up to yet. The messages went back months, not flirtatious in a vague, deniable way. Specific, intimate, the unmistakable language of two people who had crossed a line and kept crossing it. References to meeting up. References to that night specifically. Sujin grabbed the phone back from my hands, crying, begging me to stop reading. And somewhere in the next 20 minutes of broken sentences and apologies, she confessed a sexual affair with a teacher from the academy. She confirmed she had been with him that night, not at any club, not with any friends. I want to be honest about where I was in that moment. We were 4 weeks from boarding a flight to the United States. Her green card had already been approved and stamped into her passport. I had given notice at my academy. I had no support system left in Korea outside of her family, who I'd only ever known as her husband, not as someone with my own independent footing in that country. I sat on the floor of our bedroom that night and felt the entire shape of my life narrowing down to a single impossible decision. Sujin begged for forgiveness. She said it had been a moment of weakness, a final reckless thing before a huge life change, that it would never happen again, that she loved me and wanted the future we'd planned. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at our kitchen table until the sun came up, running through every version of what staying or leaving would mean, financially, logistically, emotionally, 4 weeks, a new country, a green card with her name already on it, mine to follow as a spouse, starting over in Korea with nothing, or starting over in America with everything already cracked. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made a decision I would spend years revisiting. I told her I would give her a second chance. We moved to the United States 4 weeks later, exactly as planned. The first year was hard in ways neither of us had anticipated. My resume was built entirely around 6 years of teaching English in Korea, which meant almost nothing to hiring managers back home. I did gig work for months, delivery driving, temp warehouse shifts, while Sujin began the long credentialing process to get her nursing license recognized in the States. We moved in with my parents in Ohio for 9 months, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, both of us humbled in ways that should have brought us closer. Eventually, I landed a decent job at the company I'd interned for years earlier, before Korea. A year after that, Sujin got hired there too, in an administrative role while she finished her nursing prerequisites. We moved into our own apartment. On paper, things were stabilizing. But underneath the stability, something kept fraying. We argued more than we used to, and not about anything that explained the intensity. I remember one specific night. I'd left 3 empty energy drink cans by the kitchen sink instead of throwing them out. Something I'd done 100 times before, without comment. That night, she exploded, screaming that she was going to pour the dregs onto my pillow if I didn't start respecting the apartment, a rule she had never once mentioned before that moment. She was sharp and demeaning while the anger lasted, then apologetic an hour later, like a switch had flipped back. I told myself it was stress. New country, new job, the lingering weight of what had happened in Korea that neither of us ever fully talked through. By the fall of that 3rd year in the States, we sat down together and admitted what neither of us had wanted to say out loud. We were done, not in a dramatic way, just 2 people who had quietly stopped being a couple in any way that mattered, even though we still shared a lease neither of us could afford to break alone. So, we kept living together. We called it being friends. Sometimes in the strange gravity of shared space and old habit, we were still intimate with each other, which confused both of us more than it clarified anything. That winter, while our divorce was still working its way through the paperwork, Sujin flew back to Korea to visit her family. I had no idea that trip was about to unravel everything I thought I understood about what had happened 4 years earlier. 3 days into her trip, Sujin called me, crying. I almost didn't pick up. We were technically separated, technically friendly, technically nothing to each other in any way that should have made a crying phone call from Korea feel urgent. But 4 years of marriage doesn't fully turn off just because the paperwork says it's ending, so I answered. She said she'd just gotten an angry Kakao Talk call from a woman's number she didn't recognize, and that the woman turned out to be the wife of the man Soo-jin had the affair with 4 years earlier, right before we left Korea. According to Soo-jin, the woman had somehow discovered the entire affair and was now threatening to sue her, and not just sue, but pursue formal legal damages. I told her that didn't make sense. Lawsuits over an affair sounded like something out of a movie, not something that happened in real legal systems. She explained, between sobs, that adultery isn't a criminal offense in South Korea anymore. It had been decriminalized years earlier, but it remained a civil matter. A spouse who discovers infidelity can sue the third party directly for monetary damages, a concept I genuinely never heard of. And that struck me as bizarre, even as she insisted it was completely real, and that she'd already confirmed it with a lawyer. She asked if I could help her financially. Specifically, she asked if I'd consider taking a loan against my 401k to help cover legal fees for a Korean attorney to defend her against the suit. I sat with that request for a long moment before I said anything. The first question that surfaced in my mind wasn't about the money. It was about the timing. Why would this other wife discover a 4-year-old affair at the exact moment Soo-jin happened to be back in Korea, alone, on a trip none of us had planned more than 6 weeks in advance? I asked her directly. Soo-jin insisted there had been zero contact with the man since we'd left for the United States. She said the other wife had apparently found old written correspondence, essays, messages, something from years back, tucked away somewhere, and had only just connected the pieces. It was a strange explanation, but not an impossible one. People do find old things. Timing coincidences happen. I told myself I believed her, because believing her was easier than the alternative, and because some exhausted part of me still wanted the story of our marriage to have a cleaner shape than it actually had. Over the following weeks, while still in Korea, Soo-jin hired a Korean attorney using her own credit card. She also sent me documents to sign, paperwork granting her legal authority to pursue a countersuit against the man on my behalf as well, since under Korean law, we were still technically married while the divorce was finalizing in the States. I signed without reading every line carefully, which I now understand was its own kind of mistake, the kind you make when you're tired of fighting and just want a situation to resolve itself. Months passed. The lawsuit moved through whatever process Korean civil court required. I didn't think about it much day to day. I was working, navigating an apartment I now lived in, mostly alone since Soo-jin had decided to extend her stay in Korea longer than originally planned, and trying to build something that resembled a stable life out of the wreckage of the last several years. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender introduced himself as the man being named in the lawsuit. He said he'd recently learned through his own attorney that I was listed as a co-plaintiff, and that he'd tracked down my email through records connected to the filing. He said he needed to tell me something directly because he didn't think I had the full picture. I almost deleted it. It felt like exactly the kind of message a guilty man might send to muddy the water before a court date. But something made me keep reading, and what he wrote over the next several paragraphs took the version of events I'd been carrying for months and turned it completely inside out. He said Soo-jin had contacted him the day after she landed in Korea, not weeks later, not after some chance discovery by his wife, the very next day. He said she had pushed hard to meet in person. He told me he'd been reluctant. He and his wife were actively trying for a second child at the time, and the last thing he wanted was to reopen something from years earlier. But he agreed to a lunch, mostly out of fear that ignoring her completely might cause her to escalate or show up somewhere unannounced. He said he'd kept the lunch short, avoided any of her advances, and dropped her off at a subway station afterward, believing that would be the end of it. A few days later, he said, she texted him again. This time she told him she still had deep feelings for him after all these years and wanted to meet him again in private. He said he told her, as plainly as he could, that he had no such feelings for her and had no interest in meeting again. According to his email, that response triggered something in her. In what he described as a fit of rage, she had found his wife's phone number, either pulled from his car at some point or located through a Korean messaging app search, and contacted his wife directly, confessing the entire affair herself. He attached screenshots, timestamps. The original contact message Soo-jin had sent him the day after landing in Korea, the lunch arrangement, her follow-up text about wanting to meet again, and finally, what appeared to be his wife's own account of receiving an unsolicited message from a stranger claiming to have slept with her husband years earlier. He told me clearly, his wife would never have known any of this if Soo-jin hadn't contacted her directly and confessed unprompted. I sat at my kitchen table reading those screenshots 3 or 4 times in a row, feeling the entire timeline I'd been given rearrange itself into something far more coherent and far more devastating than the version I'd accepted on the phone weeks earlier. His account didn't have the shape of a man trying to manipulate me out of a lawsuit. It had specific dates, specific message content, a sequence of events that all lined up cleanly with what little I actually knew independently. Soo-jin's version, old correspondence randomly surfacing 4 years later, exactly when she happened to be visiting, suddenly looked exactly like what it probably was. A story constructed to survive one more conversation. I called her that night. I didn't lead with the screenshots. I asked her again, directly, whether there had been any contact with him since we'd moved to the United States. She held the line. No contact, she said, none. She sounded almost annoyed that I was asking again, like I was relitigating something already settled. I told her I had an email. I told her I had screenshots with timestamps sent directly from him. The line went quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Flatter, resigned, the sound of someone who understands the story has finally run out of road. She started talking. Part 3. What the documents actually showed. What came out over the next hour, in pieces, in a voice that kept breaking and reforming, was not the story of one reckless night 4 years earlier and a chance discovery on the other side of the world. It was the story of years. Soo-jin admitted that the contact with him had never actually stopped after that night in Korea before our move. She said it had continued quietly through Instagram, then through Snapchat, once she realized direct messages disappeared more cleanly, and at some point through a shared Google Doc, the two of them used to write to each other in a way that wouldn't show up as a typical message thread if anyone happened to glance at either of their phones. She told me that in 2023, 2 full years after we'd moved to the United States and rebuilt an entire life together from nothing, she had traveled back to Korea on what I remembered as a routine family visit. During that trip, she'd met him in person. She admitted she had booked the hotel room herself, in advance, before she ever landed in the country. She said she had been deeply emotionally attached to him for most of that time. Not a passing infatuation revived briefly during a vacation, but something she had been actively maintaining in writing across years, while sitting beside me at our kitchen table, while we struggled together through gig work and my parents' guest room, and the slow climb back to financial stability, while we argued about energy drink cans and pretended the real problem in our marriage was something small enough to name. She told me the online intimacy, the romantic exchanges, had continued in some form until roughly the summer before our divorce conversation, meaning it had been running underneath the entire surface of our marriage in America almost the whole time we lived there. I didn't say much while she talked. There wasn't much left to say. I had already spent one entire night, years earlier, deciding whether a single confessed mistake was something a marriage could survive, and I had chosen yes. What she was describing now wasn't a mistake. It was a second, parallel relationship she had maintained in the total secrecy for the better part of our entire marriage. One that had only become visible to me by accident, through her own impulsive confession to a stranger's wife, through a foreign country's civil law, allowing a lawsuit that exposed an email trail neither of us ever should have seen. I think about that sequence of events more than I probably should. If she hadn't lost her temper and contacted his wife directly that day, none of this ever surfaces. If South Korea's civil code didn't allow a spouse to sue a third party for damages, there's no lawsuit, no co-plaintiff paperwork, no reason for him to ever find my email address. I would have wired money for a lawyer to defend a version of the truth that was itself a lie, believing right up until the end that the only mistake in our marriage happened on one specific night, 4 weeks before we boarded a flight to a new life. I've spent a long time since then thinking about the years before any of this happened. about the language barrier that sat underneath almost every serious conversation Sujin and I ever tried to have, about how certain emotional registers in Korean apparently never fully translated into the English we used at home, about how easily a person can become fluent in someone's daily logistics, their work schedule, their grocery preferences, their moods around the kitchen sink, without ever actually closing the distance to who they are underneath all of it. I don't know exactly what he gave her that I couldn't. I don't think I'll ever fully know, and I've made peace with not needing to. What I do know is that for years, while I was building gig work into a real career and meal prepping budget dinners in my parents' kitchen and signing legal documents in good faith based on a story I had no reason at the time to doubt, she was somewhere else entirely. Present in body, absent in every way that actually mattered. The divorce, already most of the way through the system by the time all of this came out, finalized a few months later. There wasn't much left to fight over by then. I withdrew my name from the lawsuit the moment I understood what it actually was. The man who'd emailed me never asked for anything in return for telling me the truth. I think he simply didn't want to be dragged into a legal fight that was never really his to begin with, and telling me was the fastest way out of it. I still think sometimes about that first night, the unread message sitting there on Kakao Talk, the silence stretching past midnight, Mirei's voice on the phone telling me there was no airport trip, no early flight, nothing that matched what I'd been told. I think about how completely I convinced myself, 4 weeks from a flight that would change both our lives, that a second chance was the right call. It might have been if it had actually been a second chance instead of the opening chapter of something that just kept going, quietly, underneath everything we built together for years afterward. I don't regret leaving Korea. I don't regret the job, the apartment, the slow climb back to something stable. What I regret is the version of myself that sat at that kitchen table 4 years ago and decided that one confessed affair, freshly discovered and tearfully apologized for, was the whole truth, instead of the first visible piece of something much larger that had simply learned over time to stay better hidden.